So again, today I'm going to present the weed management update. I'll be covering several topics, but mostly focusing on the management of herbicide-resistant weeds here in the state of Indiana. But before I get into that topic, the first thing I would like to comment on show you guys is some of the resources that we have available for you at Purdue to help with your weed management decisions. The first resource that we have is our website, Purdue Weed Science website. In that website, we post a lot of articles for management of weeds in corn, soybeans, the use of cover crops as well, and cereal crops such as wheat. If you have any questions, there's a lot of good resources there. We also post our research data there. So if you're looking to see the efficacy of some of the products that we've been testing, our herbicide screening, you can find all that research data. Whatever is not private or whatever can be published, we try to share it on our website as well. We also have a Facebook page. So if you use social media, I will recommend you like our page on Facebook because we try to get new information out as quickly as we get it. Stuff like new soybean technologies, new herbicides, or approval of new traits. We try to get that information out as soon as we get it. We also have a YouTube channel, and especially this year with all the restrictions of having in-person events, we try to post a lot more information on our YouTube channel. That's also another great resource that you can have. But you can also, if you prefer calling or emailing, you can email Bill or I any time of the year, and we can answer any questions you might have regarding weed management decisions. And finally, another resource that we have, and I recommend you get one if you don't have it yet, is the Weed Control Guide. That's a publication that we put together with the Ohio State University and also the University of Illinois. And one of the great things about this Weed Control Guide is that we have efficacy tables for multiple herbicides over a several range of different weeds. So if you're trying to put together a herbicide program and you're looking for the herbicides that are going to work best on the weeds that you have in a particular field, that's a great resource for your reference as well. So I recommend you guys look into that if you don't have a copy yet. And finally, we also have the Take Action initiative. That's a partnership between the private sector and the universities where they come up with new material for educational purposes, look into the management of the most problematic herbicide-resistant weeds that we have here, not only in Indiana, but in the entire Midwest. So you can have a lot of resources for free by just checking their website as well. So what I want to talk about today, there's mostly three topics. The first one being the management of herbicide-resistant weeds. What's the best approaches to manage the most problematic weeds that we have here in Indiana? Then I want to give you guys a quick summary on herbicide drift and some of the dicamba label changes that we're going to have for the next growing season and the next 5 years, because dicamba just got a new registration for soybeans. And then at the end, I want to talk about some of the 2020 weed control challenges that we had and what can we learn from those challenges and how can we prevent them in the next year as well. So first topic, herbicide resistance. That's the reason I'm here. That's the reason I have a job, is because herbicide resistance is such a big challenge, not only in Indiana, but the entire Midwest. And just in Indiana here, we have a table showing all the different weeds that have developed resistance to herbicides already. And as you can see on this table, we have a few weeds that have developed resistance to the photosystem 2 inhibitor herbicides. Those will be herbicides such as atrazine. So we have a few already resistant to atrazine. We also have a few weeds that have developed resistance to the ALS herbicides. And the ALS herbicides will be some of the residuals that we use, like Classic and First Rate or Pursue, for example. So we have quite a few different weeds with resistance to the ALS herbicides already. And one of our biggest challenges, of course, is resistance to glyphosate. We have 5 different weeds in Indiana that already developed resistance to glyphosate, that being common ragweed, giant ragweed, marestail, water hemp, and palmer amaranth. And this is a challenge because we rely on glyphosate so much for our weed management in corn and soybeans. So having resistance to glyphosate definitely makes things more complicated. But our biggest challenge in Indiana are those weeds that have developed resistance not only to glyphosate, but also to the ALS herbicides and the PPO herbicides within the same population. Those are the weeds that we call weeds with multiple herbicide resistance. And if you have those weeds in your field, particularly water hemp and Palmer amaranth, you have to transition to a soybean trait that allows you for applications of some additional herbicides. For example, Liberty soybeans or Extend soybeans or Enlist soybeans. Because if you have those populations, you cannot use Roundup Ready soybeans or non-GMO soybeans. You're not going to have any options for post-emergence. So the first weed I want to talk about today is Maristale, also known as horseweed. This is one of our most problematic weeds here in Indiana. It can behave as a summer annual, or those are the weeds that we call weeds with multiple herbicide resistance. And if you have those weeds in your field, particularly water hemp and Palmer amaranth, you have to transition to a soybean trait that allows you for applications of some additional herbicides. For example, Liberty soybeans or Extend soybeans or Enlist soybeans. Because if you have those populations, you cannot use Roundup Ready soybeans or non-GMO soybeans. You're not going to have any options for post-emergence. So the first weed I want to talk about today is Maristale, also known as horseweed. This is one of our most problematic weeds here in Indiana. It can behave as a summer annual or a winter annual weed. And what that means is that it can either emerge in the fall or in the spring. If it emerges in the fall and you're only doing a spring burn down application, you might run into a situation where those plants are a little too big for only a spring application. For that reason, we recommend that you have not only you use a two-pass approach to control Maristale in a burn down. So our recommendations for managing Maristales in Indiana is that you want to be free of Maristale at the time of planting. Controlling Maristale after you have a crop in the field is much more difficult. So you can use tillage if you're a conventional till. Tillage is very effective at controlling Maristale, especially because Maristale is such a small seed. If you bury that seed, it's not going to emerge. But if you're a no-till farmer, what we recommend is that you are aggressive with your burn down program. What do I mean by being aggressive? You want to have either a fall application followed by a spring application, especially if you have fall emerged horseweed, or you can have two applications in the spring if the weather allows. You want to make sure you control Maristale before you have a crop in the ground. Another thing that we like to point out is that you should not rely on glyphosate alone or 2,4-D alone. Glyphosate, especially because we have glyphosate resistance Maristale. But also because 2,4-D alone is not very effective for Maristale control. If you want to use a synthetic auxin, dicamba and Elevore are other synthetic auxins that are slightly more effective than 2,4-D is. But regardless of which one of those herbicides you use for a burn down, we recommend that you spray those plants when they're small because none of them are going to be effective on large plants. So you control all your Maristale before you got the crop in the ground. Another thing that you want to do is use a full rate of residual herbicides at planting. We do not recommend that you use those residual herbicides in the fall because by the time that the spring comes around, they're going to be washed out. You're not going to get the best benefit out of your investment. So save those residual herbicides for a spring application if you can. Some of the best residual herbicides for use for controlling Maristale and soybeans are herbicides such as metribuzin. You have to use at least 5 ounces if you want to get good residual activity with metribuzin, or herbicides such as Valor, Authority, or Sharpen as well. In the case of Sharpen, if you want to get some good suppression of Maristale, you have to use at least 2 ounces, which is only a good decision if you're going to grow corn, because Sharpen will have a pre-plant interval at that rate for soybeans. Our post-control options for Maristale, assuming that we have glyphosate and ALS resistance, which is actually pretty widespread in Indiana at this point. One of our choices is to grow corn. We have way more herbicide options for corn than we have for soybeans. So if you grow corn, it's a little more flexible. But if you're growing soybeans, you have to use one of those traits that allow for applications of either glufosinate, 2,4-D, or dicamba in a post-emergence application, because those are the only post-herbicides that are actually effective on Maristale post. So you have to switch to a trait like Liberty, Extend or Extend Flex that we just got approval for Extend Flex a couple of months ago, or Enlist E3 soybeans, which allow for application of 2,4-D or Liberty on top of those soybeans. So those will be the only herbicides that will be effective post-emergence for mare's tail. Another weed that is problematic in Indiana is giant ragweed. It's a highly competitive weed, and it can cause up to 90% yield reduction if it's left uncontrolled in corn and soybeans. It is also a host for stem-boring insects, and this is relevant for weed management because if those plants are injured by those insects, the herbicides are not going to be as effective because we cannot get good translocation of those herbicides throughout the plant. So if you have insects that are damaging or injuring the giant ragweed plants, you might have to adjust your coverage to make sure you get good control of those plants. And another important thing to consider about giant ragweed is that it can emerge pretty much throughout the entire growing season. It can start emerging in March, but we can have germination all the way up to August. And you got to keep that in mind for your herbicide program as well. If you only do giant ragweed management early in the season, you're going to have those late emerging plants that can still compete with your crop and produce seeds. And of course, we have documented resistance in Indiana to both the ALS herbicides and also glyphosate. And this map here is just to give you guys a little bit of an idea of the distribution of glyphosate and ALS resistance in Indiana. As you can see, we have several counties where we already confirmed glyphosate resistance. One thing to keep in mind is that we only conducted a survey for glyphosate-resistant giant ragweed, which means that just because a county is not confirmed for giant ragweed resistance to glyphosate yet, it doesn't mean it's not there yet. We just don't have the manpower to sample every field and confirm resistance. For ALS resistance, it's kind of the same case. We only are able to test those plants that are submitted to our diagnostic lab. So if we don't get a sample, we are not able to confirm the status of resistance of those populations. So what can we do to manage giant ragweed? For pre-emergence, we can use tillage close to the time of planting, or we can, if you're a no-till farmer, you can use aggressive burn-down approach again. And some of the herbicides that are effective as a burn-down will be glyphosate plus 2,4-D, or glyphosate plus sharpen, or glyphosate plus dicamba. Another combination that can be effective is gramoxone plus metribuzin plus 2,4-D. And if you have a population that is also still susceptible to ALS, there are still some populations out there that are susceptible to those herbicides, it will still be beneficial to add a herbicide such as Canopy, First Rate, Valor XOT, one of those herbicides that have an ALS in it, to provide some residual suppression of giant ragweed emergence as well. For post-emergence in giant ragweed, this is assuming that we have ALS and glyphosate resistance. What you can do, there's still an option for non-GMO soybeans. So if you're growing non-GMO soybeans for those premiums, you can still control giant ragweed by spraying Flexter followed by Cobra. That can be effective, especially if you're spraying smaller plants. If you're growing Liberty-Link soybeans, you can use glufosinate products. For Extend soybeans, you can use a dicamba product. And for Enlist soybeans, you can use either 2,4-D or Liberty as well. But regardless of which one of those combinations of traits and herbicides you use, one thing to keep in mind is that the timing of that post-application is very critical. Giant ragweed is a weed that grows very rapidly, so it's very easy to miss that application window if you're not scouting your fields on a regular basis. And also keep in mind that it can emerge late in the growing season, so you might want to go out after your post-application and see if you have any new emergence. And one thing that several growers have noticed in the past few years is that both 2,4-D and dicamba are highly effective on giant ragweed. We can take down some fairly large plants with either one of those products, but just because it works doesn't mean we should be doing it. We had the same situation with glyphosate in the late 90s when it got introduced. It was very effective until eventually it wasn't. So make sure you spray those plants according to the label, spray them when they're small, and spray them with the appropriate rate. Any questions about those two weeds that I talked about so far? All right, so now I'm going to talk about the pigweeds or amaranthus species. We have two species that are the most problematic here in Indiana. We have water hemp, which is more problematic in wet years. It likes wet soils for germination. So if you have a dry spring, you actually might get less germination with water hemp. And also Palmer amaranth, which prefers drier soils. You can actually kill Palmer amaranth if you have standing water in the field. So it doesn't like wet conditions very much. And that's one of the reasons why water hemp is generally more of a problem in Indiana than Palmer amaranth is. So this map here is just to give you an idea of the distribution of water hemp resistance here in Indiana. As you can see, we have several counties where we have confirmed glyphosate resistance, and we also have several counties where we have confirmed PPO resistance as well. PPO herbicides will be herbicides such as Cobra and Flagstar, for example. So if you're using Cobra or Flagstar post to control water hemp on soybeans, you might run into an issue if you have those populations. So what's our recommendation for management of water hemp in soybeans? This is considering that you have ALS and glyphosate resistance, but you do not have PPO resistance yet. So what you want to do to manage those water hemp plants? You want to start clean at the time of planting and use residual herbicides. Some of the best residual herbicides for water hemp suppression will be herbicides such as Authority, Valor, and Zidua. Those will be my first pick for residual herbicides, but you can also use products such as metribuzin, Duo, Warrant, Outlook, or Prowl. They also will provide some suppression, but my first pick will be the first three here on top. Then you started clean. You also want to be timely about your post application. Both water hemp and Palmer grow very rapidly, and it's very easy to miss that application window if you don't scour your fields on a regular basis. You also want to add another layer of residual herbicide with that post application, because just like giant ragweed, water hemp and Palmer can also emerge pretty much throughout the entire growing season. So if you have an early post application and you don't put any residual with that post, you're going to have new emergence after that. And the thing about water hemp and Palmer is that even smaller plants can produce a few thousand seeds. So if you leave a few plants, a few scapes at the end of the growing season, that's enough to replenish the weed seed bank. So you got to watch out for those late emerging plants. And your choice of post herbicide, of course, is going to depend on your soybean traits. Assuming you don't have PPO resistance, you can still spray Flexer, Cobra, or Blazer, and that's an option for non-GMO soybeans. And if you have Liberty soybeans, you can spray a glufosinate product, or for Extend soybeans, you can use a dicamba product. And List soybeans, you can use 2,4-D by itself or 2,4-D plus Liberty, which in my opinion will be one of the best post combinations that you could use for water hemp. And for Extend Flex that just got their approval, you can use a dicamba product or Liberty. I would not recommend at this point mixing a dicamba product with Liberty, because Liberty will increase volatility of those dicamba formulations as well. If you have PPO resistance, the only difference is that you cannot spray Flexer, Cobra, or Blazer. Those are not going to be effective post-emergence. So if you're growing non-GMO soybeans, you have no option whatsoever for post-emergence. So we recommend you do not grow non-GMO soybeans for the premiums if you have PPO, ALS, and glyphosate resistance. You can still use a PPO product such as Authority and Valor as a pre, even though they are PPO herbicides and those populations are PPO resistance. Those residual herbicides will still provide some suppression of the emergence of those plants. The only difference will be that the length of residual might be reduced a little bit. And for Palmer, the recommendation is pretty much the same. The herbicides that are effective for water hemp are also going to be effective for Palmer. The only thing you got to know is your status of resistance. You got to know if you have glyphosate, ALS, or PPO resistance in your field. Any questions so far? Go ahead.
You might not really answer this, but it's probably been 2 years or so, or 3 maybe, since I was at one of these meetings. I put most of my farm into set-aside programs because of that meeting. And what caused that was that at that time they were recommending using a combination of 2 chemicals sprayed twice a year to control these weeds. Now here we are. That's not good enough. Okay, now we're going to create an even greater soup of chemicals and put them on our farms. So my question is, has there been any research that has shown whether or not these are safe to run all this soup together? And I'm not just talking about humans, I'm also talking about our biology and our fields and Mother Nature. Has any testing been done on the soup?
Right. Yeah, so that's a good question. It's one of the things that happened with Enlist. When Enlist was getting its registration, one of the things that delayed the registration of Enlist was that they didn't test those combinations. So they had to went back, and actually the EPA required them to test combinations of 2,4-D with glyphosate and Liberty and all together, because they do have to look into those combinations and see if there's any synergies between them in non-target species, because it's not enough to control the weeds. You also got to make sure that we're not going to endanger the environment. So back probably in the 60s and 70s, registration was much easier, and a lot of this stuff didn't get tested. But the way things are today, they have to be way more true about their registration process. So they definitely look into those combinations as well. I don't know if that answered your question, but. All right, any other question? Okay, so as we can see, herbicides don't work all the time, and we're progressively developing resistance. The big question is, what can we do other than herbicides? And that's when we have to turn into the integrated weed management strategies. And some of the things that we can do involve cultural practices. Tillage is always going to be effective at controlling those herbicide-resistant weeds. Like we say, there's no resistance to steel. I know a lot of people don't want to use tillage because there's soil health benefits when you're a non-till system. But if you have a heavily infested field that is pretty much run over by water hemp or palmer, one of the things that you can do is use dip tillage and bury all that weed seed deep into the soil, and then try to control all the escapes from then on. Because it's really hard to keep a population under control when you have a heavy seed bank or a heavy infestation. So using tillage and bury all that seed deep into the soil can actually be helpful to try to reduce the pressure on those herbicides as well. We also have research on cover crops, and there are several cover crops that have been showing promising in southern states like Arkansas, for example. Unfortunately, our weather here in Indiana is way more unpredictable, so our results with cover crop are way more variable. It's kind of a mixed bag for year to year. So cereal rye from our research has been showing as the most promising cover crop to suppress those herbicide-resistant weeds. However, you cannot rely on the cover crop by itself. You still have to use a solid herbicide program to still control those weeds. A cover crop by itself is not going to be sufficient. And also, one thing that our research has shown is that annual rye is not effective at suppressing those herbicide-resistant weeds. So if you have to pick a cover crop, I would recommend cereal rye over annual rye. Hand weeding, this is a practice that is becoming commonplace, especially in southern United States, in states like Arkansas again, where herbicide resistance is way worse than it is here. We still are not in that place in Indiana, but one thing to keep in mind is that if you have a few escapes at the end of the growing season, it definitely pays off to go there and eliminate those palmer and water hemp plants, because those plants will produce a few 100,000 seeds in a single plant. So if you manage a few escapes this year, it can definitely makes your life easier in the following years by reducing the weed seed bank and reducing the pressure on herbicides for selection for resistance. You also want to keep in mind that it's not enough to control the big weeds only in your field. You also got to look at the edges of the field, because a lot of times those weeds are thriving right next to your field and the borders, and they can get introduced into your field. So keep in mind, you got to control those weeds in the ditches and edges of the field as well. And finally, the combines are one of the great spreaders of pigweed seeds from field to field. So keep in mind, you gotta harvest those heavily infested fields last. And after you harvest those heavily infested fields, take your combine back to the shop and make sure you clean it really well. Get rid of all that weed seed because it's gonna be a problem the next year. And if you can afford to, maybe set that combine on fire. But if you cannot, make sure it's clean for the next growing season. And this is just to illustrate how easily those weeds can be spread around. There's a picture from a farmer that a few years back, he purchased some hay from Kansas. And a few weeks later, he noticed some weird looking weed that was growing in his hay piles. And that was Palmer amaranth. And Kansas is notorious for having very serious problems with herbicide resistance. In Indiana, we only have a 3-way resistant Palmer amaranth. In Kansas, they have a 5-way resistance Palmer amaranth population. So the status of resistance there is way worse than it is here in Indiana. So you definitely don't want to get Palmer amaranth from a state like Kansas because it's likely to have multiple herbicide resistance already. And also another picture here, maybe you guys can see it, but here there is a water hemp plant growing on top of this house. And there's actually some research that Missouri conducted at the University of Missouri where they shown that birds, migratory birds, can ingest Palmer and water hemp seeds, and those seeds are still viable after digestion. So they can also spread those water hemp and Palmer amaranth seeds around from field to field. So even if you don't have those plants in your field yet, you always got to scout because they can be introduced from anywhere, basically. All right, any questions regarding herbicide resistance or management of a particular weed? All right, so now I'm gonna switch to herbicide drift in Indiana. Just basically give you a quick summary of the situation. Herbicide drift in Indiana has always been an issue since we started using herbicides. One of a few repeat offenders when it comes to drift are herbicides such as 2,4-D, glyphosate, dicamba, and sharpen. And the reason that we normally drift those herbicides is because those are the herbicides that we use during burn down. And what's the weather like during burn down? Very windy. So that's the reason we commonly drift those herbicides. But we usually had only about 100 drift complaints a year before the introduction of the Extend soybeans and the possibility of spraying dicamba over the top of those soybeans. Those numbers went significantly up. And as you can see, in the first year of Extend soybeans in Indiana, we jumped from 100 total complaints to 233 total complaints. And over half of those complaints are related to dicamba. And the trend continued in the following years. We had a record number in 2019 with 275 total complaints, and about 70% of those complaints were dicamba suspects. So with all those drift complaints, it kind of overwhelmed the Office of Indiana State Chemist to just go to those fields and talk to all those farmers and investigate all those drift complaints. So for the year of 2020, the Office of Indiana State Chemist established a statewide cutoff date that was June 20th for this growing season, and we actually went down to only about 82 dicamba complaints in this past growing season, which is way better than the previous year, but still we would like to see those numbers go down even further. Another thing that happened in the past growing season is that we have a court decision by the Ninth Circuit, which vacated the registration of 3 dicamba products. So I don't know if you guys probably heard that Extenimax and Genia Effexapen, they lost their registration in June. And it was up in the air until like a month ago if we ever gonna get those products back for the future. But if you've been following the ag news or maybe you talked to your chemical or seed dealer, you probably already heard that those herbicides got a new registration from the EPA, and that's a 5-year registration actually. So those products will be in the market, at least according to the EPA, for the next 5 growing seasons. There are some changes to this label to try to address some of those drift complaints. One of those changes is that now the new buffer requires, the new label requires a downwind buffer of 240 foot, which used to be 110, so they increased that buffer. And if you are in a county that has endangered species, that buffer has to be actually 310 foot. So if you're planning on growing extend soybeans, keep in mind if you have some weird shaped field or if you have a small field, you might not be allowed to spray half of that field because of those buffer requirements. So you gotta make that math and make those calculations to see how much of your field you're actually gonna leave without spraying because of those restrictions. There is opportunity for the growers to reduce that buffer by using hoods or hooded sprayers. And if they use hooded sprayers, they can reduce that buffer to 110 downwind or 240 if you have endangered species listed in your county. The federal label also now establishing a nationwide cutoff date of June 30th. So last year was a restriction from the state chemist. This year is actually a restriction from the federal label where farmers can only apply dicamba over the top to soybeans up to June 30th. And the EPA is also going to require a pH buffering agent to be added on top of the dicamba product that you're actually going to spray. So some of the buffering agents are still in the process of being approved by the EPA. The Bayer has one that is going to be a vapor grip. So if you've been using Extendimax, Extendimax already had some vapor grip added to the jug, but now they're going to sell some separate jug with extra vapor grip to be added to that tank to reduce volatility. BASF is also going to have their own pH buffering agent, so if you're purchasing from them, you have to talk to them and see what product they'll be offering as a pH buffering agent. Another change that happened is that the EPA is going to allow the states to expand the use of those dicamba products by working with the EPA, but they cannot use the 24C section of the label to restrict dicamba regulations any more than they already are. Last year, the Office of Indiana State Chemist used the 24C section of the label to set up the June 20th cutoff date. They can no longer use the 24C for that purpose anymore. If you have any questions regarding dicamba, you can also go to the Office of Indiana State Chemist website. They're still in the process of evaluating the federal label. The Office of Indiana State Chemist would like to impose some additional restrictions to the federal label, but without the 24C, that may become more complicated. So we expect to hear from the Office of Indiana State Chemist in probably the next few months to see how they're going to position themselves after that EPA decision. And the EPA also has a website where they try to answer some of those questions related to this new approval of dicamba products as well. Does anybody have any questions about dicamba or this new registration? All right. All right, another technology that is in the market, at least since last year, is the Enlist soybeans. The Enlist soybeans, we can spray the 2,4-D choline formulation, being that Enlist 1 or Enlist Duo. Those herbicides also have their own application restrictions, just like Extendimax and Eugenia and Fexapen products. However, those restrictions are different and, in my opinion, also a little more flexible. So if you're growing Enlist soybeans, you have to go to the website to look at the application restrictions. The buffer is different. You only have to leave a 30-feet buffer to a sensitive area. So that's way more flexible than the dicamba labels, in my opinion. But just like the dicamba products, you cannot spray if the wind is blowing towards a susceptible crop. So if the wind is blowing towards a susceptible crop, it doesn't matter how far that field is, you should not spray those products. The cutoff date for the Enlist products, there's no calendar date. You can spray up to full flowering or the R2 growth stage. So that will be the only cutoff for Enlist products. We have to check the website to see which other products are approved. for tank mix with Enlist. And one of the advantages of the Enlist is that it can actually be mixed with ammonium sulfate, which is not the case for dicamba products. Wind restrictions, 3 to 15 miles per hour, spray volume 10 to 15 GPA, and boom height of 24 inches above the target. So as you can see, clearly the restrictions for Enlist are a little more easy to follow than the Extend technology. We'll see how the next years are going to shake up in terms of herbicide drift to see if those restrictions for the Enlist technology are going to change as well. So, considering that we're going to have both the Extend soybeans in the market and the Enlist soybeans in the market, we're likely to have some 2,4-D drifting from the Enlist fields towards other crops, and we're probably going to have some dicamba drifting from the Extend soybeans towards other crops. And for that reason, we came up with this publication that can help not only the growers, but CCAs and consultants to differentiate 2,4-D and dicamba injury on soybeans. There are some subtle differences that we can look at. They're subtle, but if you're looking at the right things, you can actually differentiate between these two herbicides. So, what are the differences between 2,4-D and dicamba drift? So for 2,4-D, some of the symptoms that we see are leaf strapping, stem twisting, and callus formation. And I'm going to show a few pictures of that in a little bit. And for dicamba, we mostly only see leaf cupping. Another thing about dicamba is that we can have injury at very low rates of dicamba. It takes only about 0.2% of the field rate to actually get dicamba injury, and soybeans are not tolerant to the dicamba technology. Another thing is that those symptoms are slower to develop. It might take up to 2 to 3 weeks to actually start seeing that cupping on soybeans. You might not see it right away, but those symptoms can persist for quite a while after they happen. But for 2,4-D, those plants are going to show symptoms within a few hours after exposure. So within 3 to 4 hours, you can already see some of those symptoms, including especially leaf drop or stem twisting. But yield losses will only occur if you have over 5% of the field rate. So basically what I'm telling here is that it takes way more 2,4-D than dicamba to actually cause yield losses to soybeans. And another thing to keep in mind is that those yield losses depend on the growth stage at the time of exposure. If you get hit with dicamba and 2,4-D during the vegetative growth stage early on in the season, you're less likely to see yield reductions. But if you get hit during reproductive stages, during flowering, you're more likely to see those yield reductions. And this picture here is just to illustrate the symptoms of 2,4-D exposure. For 2,4-D, you have a callus formation on the stems. You also have leaf strapping and stem twisting. You're very unlikely to see stem twisting and callus if you have dicamba drift. In some cases, you actually can see some leaf strapping with dicamba, but most of the time it's only cupping. And again, for dicamba symptoms, most of the time only cupping, as you can see in the fields. But if you have tank contamination with dicamba, you can actually have meristem death, so the growing point dies, but the rest of the plant remains alive. Just to show you guys how tricky it is to evaluate dicamba drift and actually measure yield losses, I'd like to ask you guys, which one of those two fields do you think is more injured? Is it the one on the right or the one on the left? Right. So we can pretty much all agree that the field to the right, or at least to the right of you guys, looks more injured than the field to the left. But actually, the field to the left got hit with a rate that is 10 times higher than the field to the right. So why doesn't it look more injured? Well, if you actually get close to this field and start looking through those plants, you can see that the meristem is dead. So those plants are no longer growing anymore. They're not putting out new trifoliates. And usually, the new trifoliates are the ones that show cupping. So if you don't have new trifoliates, you're not going to see any cupping. So if you drive by these two fields, you might think this one is the more injured one, but actually you're more likely to see yield reductions here. One of the greatest indicators of yield reduction with dicamba is plant height. So if you get plant height reduction, you're likely to see yield reduction as well. If you see mostly just cupping, you're probably not, it's more variable, it's harder to tell. All right, another thing kind of related to dicamba is also the approval of the Extend Flex soybeans. The Extend Flex soybeans are soybeans that allow for application of both dicamba products, glyphosate, and also glufosinate products, which would be Liberty or other products that contain glufosinate. And that can serve as an alternative, especially if you need to do a post-emergence application and the weather conditions do not allow for a dicamba application. You could do a glufosinate application to take care of those herbicide-resistant weeds. It's not clear yet if the industry is going to recommend tank mixing glufosinate with dicamba yet. From what our research shows, glufosinate can increase volatility, so from our standpoint, we would not recommend tank mixing dicamba products with Liberty in the same tank. Any questions so far? All right, so the last topic I want to talk about is some of the 2020 weed control challenges that we had in the past growing season. The first one, and this was a big one this past year, was herbicide carryover, especially for herbicides such as Callisto. We had a lot of issues with Callisto carryover. We can also have carryover herbicides like atrazine and Flexstar, for example, or the ALS herbicides such as Canopy, Classic, and First Rate as well. So what is herbicide carryover? Herbicide carryover basically is when herbicides that were sprayed in the previous growing season still remain in the soil in sufficient concentration to cause injury to the following crop. And herbicide carryover is influenced for a few different factors. Soil texture and soil properties, rainfall, and herbicide application timing are all factors that can influence the likelihood of having herbicide carryover. If you have a soil that is sandy with a low pH and low organic matter, you're more likely to see herbicide carryover. Also, if you have a low amount of rainfall after the application of those residual herbicides, you're more likely to see carryover in the next growing season as well. And the reason that we had so much carryover issues in 2020 was because we had a lot of late applications in 2019 because of that delayed growing season and the rains. So again, corn and soybean herbicides that were applied late in this growing season and they were followed by a dry spell, they can result in carryover in the next growing season. Some of the corn herbicides that can cause carryover include herbicides such as atrazine and also the HPPD herbicides, especially Callisto. Some of the soybean herbicides that can carry over include the ALS inhibitor herbicides, such as Classic, Purdue, First Rate, and Scepter. And we also have one PPO herbicide, Flexstar, that can also carry over to corn the next year. If you have to do a late application of a PPO herbicide on soybeans, I would recommend that you switch Flexstar with Cobra because Cobra does not have any of those rotational restrictions that Flexstar does. And you always got to look at the label to see what those rotational intervals are and see if you're in the clear or not when you're doing a residual herbicide application. If you want to know more about residual herbicides and carryover, there's a couple different articles that I recommend. Is good reading of how to mitigate some of those carryover concerns as well. Another problem that we've been seeing not only in this past growing season, but in the last 2 or 3 years is some dicamba populations that have been showing some tolerance to dicamba applications. So every now and then we get some farmers that call us up and say, hey, we sprayed dicamba and we did not get good activity on water hemp. And there are several reasons that can happen. Sometimes it's due to poor application technology. Sometimes the farmer was using a lower rate than the recommended rate, or they were spraying weeds that are a little too tall for that application. However, every now and then we actually got calls from farmers that sprayed everything according to the label and they still were not able to control those water hemp plants with dicamba. And this is what the plants look like when we actually went to collect samples. So as you can see, those plants are injured in the growing point here, but they start having new growth from the lateral meristems as well. So we collected seeds from those fields and we screened those populations in our greenhouse. And that's basically kind of what we saw. We tested 3 different populations that were suspected for resistance to dicamba. The first row here in the left is a population that we knew was susceptible to dicamba. And the other 3 populations were the 3 candidates for resistance. And as you can see, all those 3 populations, we had about 5 to 6 plants out of 8 plants that survived a quarter-pound rate of dicamba, which is not the highest rate, but it used to be the rate that we used 10 years ago, and it used to be sufficient to control water hemp back 10 years ago. Now the dicamba products, they all label to use half a pound, and that's the rate that they require now for all labels. We still got some survivors here in the upper part of the picture that you can see. That they survived half a pound of dicamba, and this is 28 days after application. When we spray a full pound of dicamba, we're able to control all those plants in all those suspected resistant populations. But again, the label does not allow for applications of a full pound of dicamba. So what I'm trying to show you guys here is that we've slowly been selecting for a low level of resistance to dicamba. And if we keep relying on a single herbicide with no residual herbicides in combination, we're going to run into the same situation that we had with glyphosate. So we want to use an integrated weed management approach, use cover crops if you can, and use other cultural practices to eliminate the pressure on herbicides. Otherwise, dicamba might not be a viable product in the long run. So keep that in mind. Another issue that we saw in the last couple of seasons is the antagonism of both dicamba products and also warrant on the activity of clethodim herbicides, such as Selectmax, for example, especially on the control of volunteer corn. And these are some of the recommendations that we actually got from Valent for the use of clethodim for control of volunteer corn. What they do recommend, if you're tank mixing Selectmax with warrant, you want to use AMS to increase activity, efficacy of the Selectmax. You may want to use a higher rate if you want to tank mix with warrant. Add crop oil, and they also shown that a few acidifier products can also increase Selectmax activity when tank mixed with warrant. So these are some of the acidifiers that they listed. If you're tank mixing Selectmax, warrant, and dicamba product for a post-emergence application to soybeans, what they say is that you should not tank mix those products, make split applications instead. 3 days should be enough to avoid that antagonistic effect. But if you do want to tank mix to save on application costs, what they do recommend is that you increase the Selectmax rate, use crop oil, and limit the rate of warrant to only 2 pints to the acre. So based on those recommendations from Valent, we also run some of our own experiments looking to the control of volunteer corn that was tolerant to both glyphosate and glufosinate. And what we tested were 2 rates of clethodim, either 4 ounces or 6 ounces of a 2-pound formulation. And what we were able to show is that dicamba by itself can antagonize clethodim activity to some extent. So we went from about 98%, 95% control to only about 80% control when we tank mix clethodim with dicamba. And when we tank mix clethodim with dicamba and a warrant or acetochlor, we only got about 20% control of that volunteer corn. So the 3-way mix of a warrant, a dicamba product, and clethodim is very antagonistic. We will not recommend tank mixing those products in a single application if you don't have to. And even with a high rate of clethodim, here being 6 ounces of clethodim, we still only got about 80% control. And that's a 2-pound formulation of clethodim.
So we did the full rate of clethodim this year, and I think it was the dicamba and the glyphosate. We had volunteer corn out the wazoo. Mm-hmm. They came back and said we need to run a rate and a half of the clethodim.
Right.
Is that, I mean, I have to assume that was pretty widespread, or what? Because there was volunteer corn everywhere.
Right. Yeah. So that's what was the rate they initially used?
I think it was 6. I thought it was 7 ounces, but it might have been 6. It was a full rate. And then they came
Right.
It didn't say dicamba and Roundup. I think we use dicamba and Roundup, but your slide would say dicamba and Roundup and clethodim wasn't a good option, right?
Right. So it was a Select Max or was it a different clethodim? Because the Select Max is only a pound formulation. Okay. Yeah, we tested 6 ounces, and with 6 ounces, when we take mix acetochlor or warrant with it, we only got about 80% control. So.
Is it conceivable that we're supposed to use right and a half of clethodim?
Yeah, when you're dealing with antagonism, it is a common recommendation. You can actually go up to 16 ounces of clethodim. It's more expensive, but it's on the label. If you got to increase the rate so much, you might just start considering actually doing split applications. So, I'm sorry. That's kind of the issue. Like, you want to save on application costs, or you want to save on herbicide costs. So you got to do the math. It's a physiological response that those products have when they're taken mixed together. It's pretty much the only thing you can do is either split or increase the rate, and that's the only thing we can recommend. We also saw the same thing with Gizalofop or Assure-2. So when you take mixing Assure-2 for volunteer corn control, you also have a pretty strong antagonistic effect with dicamba. As you can see here, dicamba plus glyphosate plus the 4-ounce rate of Gizalofop or Assure, we got 0% control of volunteer corn. And when he increased the rate to 6 ounces of Assure, we got only about 70% control. So I would not recommend mixing Assure products with a dicamba product by any means, because there's a pretty strong antagonistic effect, even stronger than the response that we get with clethodim as well. And these are kind of some of the pictures just to illustrate what we saw with those combinations. So those plants are pretty much completely alive 21 days after application. That's kind of all I have for today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Marcelo. And if you have any questions, and if you didn't get his email or whatever, you can reach out to me, and I can put you in contact. So, just before you go, I don't think you said in this one, but he and Bill always say with the water hemp control, if you can't do those things, you plant corn. And this year I saw, well, it was actually, I think it was not water hemp, it was a palmer, but it was growing over the top of the corn in an undisclosed field to protect the people. So we can have.
One thing that we got to mention is that not only grow corn, but use the right herbicide.
Yes, grow corn and use the right herbicides to control that. So they can grow. It was a couple feet taller than the corn out there, so it can get pretty big. All right, thanks. All right, hopefully this microphone doesn't kick out on me. All right. There we go. All right, so first I got 2 different things I'm going to talk about. First is an update from the state chemist's office. I mentioned some of the things, but there'll be some more things, some regulatory things to talk about. So this year, the state chemist retired, Dr. Bob Waltz. He retired in this spring. And so I'm not sure when he started with the state chemist, but he went through saw the office through some difficult times for them with all this dicamba stuff that increased their workload. And also there was the Imprellis. That was more, you probably haven't heard about that, but that was one for a lawn herbicide. And they got approved, and then it started causing all sorts of damage to ornamentals. So then that got taken off right away. So he is replaced this fall. Dr. Mark LeBlanc was appointed then. He comes from LSU. And so the state chemists, if you don't know that, they're housed on Purdue University. So he's an adjunct professor at Purdue. All right, so some things that we'll talk about this spring. We had that late frost, so it was in May 8th statewide. Lots of ornamentals got hit with that. There was some corn up too, but a lot of that, the growing point on corn when it's real young there is below the ground, and what I saw that was up around here survived just okay. I know Bob Nielsen down at the agronomy farm, he tracked some that it looked all dead, but since the growing point was protected under the soil, it came back up. But we had a lot of ornamentals. I had some trees get hit at my house. In fact, but I was lucky my peach trees were blooming, but they survived, so I had peaches. They weren't lucky farther south. Southern Indiana, all the apples and peaches were all. But with late frosts, the state chemists, they got a lot of complaints saying, oh, we got hit by herbicide, but it was actually this late frost. So that was a kind of a problem that they had, and some people aren't always willing to listen to those sort of things. So another thing they're working on is civil penalties. I'm not sure when it started, but the current civil penalty is, I think, maximum for private applicators is $100. And maybe that was a bigger deal back, I'm not sure, 20, 30 years ago, but that's not as big a deal, and they need to restructure it to make it more up with the times. So the Pesticide Review Board, they're recommending a new structure. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but they made a committee with representatives from industry, so not just ag, but lawn care and all sorts of other ones got together and get to restructure those penalties. And so why they haven't done it in the past, because they can't just decide. That has to go through the state legislature, which can take a while. So that's where it's at right now. They made the recommendations of the state legislature, and they'll have to pass that. All right, so in September, the state chemists began offering a new core exam along with a new core manual. So you guys have already passed the test, so as long as you keep coming there, you won't have to take it. But if you know of someone who's interested in taking it, you can if you're local in my counties, you can have them contact me. I've got that new manual costs $30, and if you don't want to drop $30 for the manual, you can borrow one from me for free, just as long as you return it when you're done for that. So it's basically, the exam is very similar. They just kind of updated some things. They cover the same topics. All right, so private applicator renewals. They had to make some changes to line up with some federal rules. So the new minimum age for a private applicator will have to be 18. I think everyone in here is okay on that. So that's effective January 1st. Hopefully, I know we talked about that, you should have gotten if your renewal up this year, you should have gotten that in the mail in October. So review and return, $20. And like I said, if this is your last credit you need, write on the renewal the program number and everything. And it's going to take a little time in their office to get things sorted out because they're not all there right now. And they're going to send the license at the first of the year after then sometime. And once that's approved, if you're not sure, if you're computer savvy, you can go on the internet on their site and you can look it up. And when you check your credits, you can also print off another one because they're not sending out the nice plastic ones anymore, just paper. You can print off another one from there if you lose that one too. So, all right. So Clean Sweep. Is everyone familiar with the Clean Sweep program? Everyone heard of that? So the state chemists, they run this every year, and it's in 4 or 5 locations around the state, and they kind of move it around. And it's you can dispose of unwanted or expired pesticides there, and it's no cost up to 250 pounds. And after that, it's only $2 a pound. So I think that's a really good way to really cheap to dispose of those. So be on the lookout. That's usually in the fall, like August, September timeframe. So if you have some that's things that you need to get rid of, be on the lookout for that. All right. So what everyone wants to hear about COVID-19. So their operations, like most places, have been affected. A lot of their people are working from home. The labs and offices are closed to the public. The testing centers, so they used to do, I don't think they're doing it anymore, down on Purdue's campus, monthly tests. You could go take a test for free, basically there. Now they're moving it all to Ivy Tech with the testing centers there. So you'd have to, it's nicer because you don't have to go down to campus. You can go somewhere maybe closer, but it's not free. I'm not sure how much it costs to do the tests there. But they're open now. So hopefully you guys don't have to take the test again. All right, so with the commercial applicators, there's only a handful of trainings that were canceled. And so they're not going to extend the deadline or anything to get your credits. So I think around here I got all my trainings in last March before everything shut down. So there are online training opportunities as well. If you need more credits, you can ask me if you need another class by the end of the year. I can help you out find something. All right, so one thing they did suspend the licensing requirements on registered technicians. This is more on the commercial side until the 31st, the end of this year. The supervision requirements are still in place. So they're going to have to be supervised by a licensed person, and obviously you're going to have to follow the labels because the labels are still in effect, and you're going to wear PPEs because that's part of the label as well. All right, so with the enforcement, all these things are still in place. So the sale and distribution of restricted use pesticides, those are still only to licensed applicators. And then the supervision of non-certified, that's still in place. They still have to be supervised. And you have to follow the label. This last point here with the false or misleading information on coronavirus, that wouldn't apply to ag stuff, but I think it falls under like sanitizers and stuff probably falls under the state chemist umbrella there. And then we had I guess, way back in the spring, people making claims on stuff. So, all right, so use inspections. So some of these inspections of facilities, they might be virtual. They might call you up or send an email and ask you to take a picture of something. It's probably going to be easier than them coming out and bothering you to look at things. So you just take a picture and send it to them. If they're doing in-person things, it's going to be the usual, except what are we doing now? Face masks and social distancing. So complaint investigations. So they're still conducting complaint investigations like usual, but again, with masks and distancing. So this year, you saw some of that, what Marcelo talked about. We had 205 ag drift complaints, with 72 were related to dicamba and 16 were aerial applicators. All right, so hemp. Who's interested in growing hemp? No? I know in Stark County, we had several people I know this year growing it. So 2020 was still a research year, so they didn't have a fee attached to it. 2021 is going to change that, so they got the plan approved from the federal government, and so there's going to be fees involved with that. So a grower license is going to be $750, and a handler license is going to be $750. And depending on, you might need both. I'm not sure what all is involved in handling. The application is going to be online. They were hoping to have it ready, I think, last month, but they had problems, so hopefully in January it's up and running. With hemp questions, with the regulatory side, you can reach out to state chemist, that's Laura Fritz there. If you have other questions like on how to grow it and some of that thing, Purdue has a good hemp website, so if you search Purdue hemp, it'll come up to the website. And part of the hemp, distinguishing the hemp from marijuana is all about the THC. So it's got to be under 0.3, and if it goes over that, you're out. I mean, you have to destroy your crop. So we've got some important information on there, reports from the different varieties, because that's going to have an effect on those levels there, which ones have gone hot in the past. So you can look up that on that website too. Another thing with that is the stress. So under drought stress, those plants have higher THC levels. So those are all things to consider. And there's just lots of information there. And if you have questions on growing and stuff, you can reach out to Marguerite through that website there. All right, so paraquat. So this is an old chemical, but it's still in use. And they got new labels were updated in 2019. So in this one, it's a restricted use pesticide, and it's only used by a certified applicator. So this is one you cannot have supervise someone else to use. So you as a certified applicator have to do the application, the mixing, and the handling yourself. So there's going to be some product-specific training, which I think is online. So you have to go to the website and do those, and that's once every 3 years. And keep a record of that training. It's like everything, you need to keep a record. And it'll give you a card when you purchase it. And there's going to be different packaging for some of these containers. Skipping out. So back to paraquat. All right, always store this in an original container. Don't put it in another container like a food or beverage. This is very deadly stuff. One sip can kill you. And so there have been cases in the past where it's in a pop bottle and someone takes a sip, and that's all it takes. And it's not a pretty thing to happen. So always keep an original container. Contact with skin may result in poisoning. Keep it in locked storage, and not for storage or use in residential or public settings. So this is one thing you want to keep very close control on. All right, so just a little bit from the regulatory side, update on dicamba stuff. So again, a reminder, all ag dicamba products are restricted use pesticides. So this is, again, your corn herbicides as well. So only for sale or use by certified applicators. So with the old formulations, it's still okay to use supervised. So you have license, and someone under your supervision without a license can apply those ones on the old corn ones. The new ones, for use on soybeans, those have to be handled, mixed, and applied by a certified applicator. So again, that's been that way, I think, for a year at least. And then keeping those records, restricted use pesticide records, again, for 2 years. And then with those products used on the soybeans, those have additional record keeping requirements as well. You've probably seen all that. You have to take down all the weather and all that stuff, and when you visited websites. So they, like Marcelo said, with the June 20th cutoff date, they had compared with past years, they had a big drop off of complaints relating to dicamba. And so most of the ones that they saw this year were when the wind was blowing towards susceptible crops. So keep that in mind when doing those applications, and that's on the label. You're not supposed to do that, so keep in mind that's where most complaints come from. All right, we already covered this. All right, any questions on regulations or anything from state chemists? Not sure if I can answer it all. Yep.
$100. So somebody's
Yeah, they've got they said there's a max of $100. Although the one thing they have been doing before they get the restructuring from the state, so I forget the exact number, but they've got certain, if you're a repeat offender, they're going to take away your license. So stuff like that. So especially with things like the dicamba, if you didn't do the training or ignoring something and you've had several violations, you could lose your license for a couple years. So that's one thing that they've been doing as well. Any other questions? Yeah, I'm not sure what they submitted for the fee structure and everything. I know for commercial violations is higher than $100 as well, but that might be as well changing. All right, so we'll head on to, we're going to talk about pollinators and protecting pollinators when you're applying pesticides. All right, so this presentation, we're going to talk about the importance of pollinators and how you as pesticide applicators can help protect pollinators while you're still doing your applications. And how to use these pesticides with minimal risk to pollinators, and about the potential effects of treating flowering crops with insecticides that are toxic to pollinators. So why should we care about pollinators? I should start out, we're talking about bees, so I need to tell my bee joke. So why do bees hum and buzz? Because you'd hum and buzz too if someone took your honey and nectar. I don't know, my grandpa always told that joke. He was a beekeeper. All right, so back to pollinators. So 80% of all flowering plants require an animal pollinator. So if we're just talking about the big picture, the environment, that's incalculable, how all these different things affect our environment. So fruit and seed production needed for the survival of these flowering plants. It's got a lot of food for wildlife. So songbirds, they eating these flowers and berries. Wild turkeys, grouse, bear, deer, and elk all depend on these plants for survival. And getting closer to home, so here's a picture here. We've got your breakfast with bees and your breakfast without bees. So all these things with your juice, your fruits, your jelly, that all goes away without pollinators. So the value of that crop, we were talking about dollars here, almost $19 billion in the U.S., these crops that rely on the pollinators. And it's over 200 billion worldwide. All right, so pollinators. So what are they? Insects are the most common pollinators and most abundant. So why do we think about honeybees are the big one, bumblebees, blueberry bees. There's tons of bees out there. But also other things. So we have butterflies, beetles, flies, and even wasps are pollinators. So one thing on the flies, you don't often think about that. There are certain plants that attract flies. They kind of match up there. So who's ever heard of a skunk cabbage? No? Well, it's a wildflower, but it's one of the first in the spring to come out. And it doesn't smell very good. And flies like dead things, right? So another thing, how about pawpaws? Ever heard of pawpaws? So that's another one that flies. And what some old timers say is like, well, you get some roadkill and you throw it by the pawpaw to attract the flies to get better pollination on your pawpaws. So interesting things. So some terminology, when a pollinator is visiting a bloom or a flower in search of nectar, which they get the carbohydrates from, and pollen, which they get protein from, it's called foraging. So the pollinators are out foraging when they're visiting flowers. All right, so the European honeybee is what we use a lot of times for most commercial pollination purposes. So it's kind of domesticated, it's our domesticated insect that we can easily move around. So these semi-foals of bees, they'll travel the country. They'll go to Florida, to Maine, and all over. I think they don't make the money on the honey. They make it on the people pay the beekeepers to have their hives out there. So why care about pollinators? So in Indiana, some crops that require these pollinators, apples, blueberries, cucumbers, melons, pumpkins. So with those three, there's actually a native pollinator that does a better job. So it's called a squash bee, and they live in the ground. And squash bee, they really like the squash family with cucumbers and everything. So a lot of times they'll put the honeybees out there, but those squash bees do a lot better job. Other things have hives, and they take care of them so they can see what's living and everything. So in the 2013, 2014, they lost about close to a quarter of their hives and commercially in the nation. So that's not a good number. And it's really hard to tell what our native pollinators are doing too, because they're out wild and it's really hard to count those populations. So what are causes of some decline? So some big ones, we've got lack of nutrition. So they're not finding enough food to eat. Viruses and diseases are another things that happen. There's also environmental pesticides, and it's not just agriculture. There's lots of things from other sectors as well, homeowners and everything. There's also pathogens like mites. And so it's a combination. It's not a one thing, so it's one thing on top of another that's having an effect on these honeybees. So the varroa mite, that's a big one. So basically, these mites, it's kind of like a tick to us. So they'll latch on and try to suck on their bee blood there, and they'll weaken them. So the life cycle of a honeybee is only, I think, 30 to 45 days. And so they'll start out, you see in the comb there, and then when they reach their adult stage, they have different jobs throughout their life. So they start out in the hive, doing stuff like feeding the pupae and everything, cleaning up, and they'll slowly move out of the hive to guarding the hive entrance. And the last job for the honeybees is foraging. So those bees you see out flying around at flowers, they're on their last job. And so after that, they die, and that's just their life cycle. So with all these mites on there, they might not kill them outright, but they weaken them. So if you got 30 to 45 days of life cycle, and if you pare that down, reduce that, you have less time foraging before they die, and so you're getting less food in the hive, and it's just a kind of weakening of the system that way. All right, question here. Why is it important to protect pollinators? Well, all of the above. They're important for humans and plants and wildlife. All right, which of these following foods depend on animals to pollinate? Everything but wheat. So wheat's a wind-pollinated one. All right, in addition to honeybees, what other animals can pollinate flowers? Everything but the cattle. They don't make too good pollinators there. All right, what are factors affecting pollinator health? So a combination of a lot of different things. All right, so now we're going to talk about stuff as pesticide applicators, how you can help reduce risk to honeybees and other pollinators. So we're going to look at how these pesticides can harm bees, recognizing where bees are going to be, so looking at their habits and everything, talking about the labels, using integrated pest management, so sometimes pesticides are not the answer, and following best management practices. So most pesticides are not toxic to bees and other pollinators. So pesticides, as you know, include fungicides, herbicides, miticides, and insecticides. So as general rule, the bees are insects, so insecticides are going to be where our greatest risk is for harming pollinators. However, not all insecticides are toxic to pollinators. So where can a pollinator poisoning, where are some situations where that can occur? So a direct exposure during application. So this would be applying over a flowering crop where there's active feeding there, where the bees are getting hit by the insecticide. Residues. So these are picked up so that an application has been made and the pollinators go in and they pick up those residue and they can be taken back to the hive. And also residues from non-crop plants, so weeds and stuff next to the plant. All right, so residual toxicity. So some of these products are going to remain toxic to bees for a while after the application is made. And it's going to be toxic to bees via contact with the plants. So this is called residual toxicity. So, and then there's extended residual toxicity, ERT, for an extended period, which they don't really define what an extended period is, following the application. So these pesticides may not be applied to blooming crops or weeds. So we're trying to remove that risk for them, for the bees. So what are some of these ERT pesticide? So some of these families of pesticides, so the organophosphates, so something like malathion, that's one of those ERT. The carbonates, carbaryl, it'd be like 7. The neonicotinoids, one of the examples would be imidacloprid, these names are all tough, and the pyrethroids. Those are some of these ERT ones. So again, always read the label to know what you're applying and which ones are going to be a risk to bees. All right, so looking at the honeybees, kind of a day in the life of a honeybee. Now, these are the old ones that are going out to feed. So they're going to feed during the daytime and when it's warm out. So if it's above 55 degrees. Now other pollinators, so honeybees they can be kind of lazy. So they're not going to go out in cold and rainy, but other pollinators will go out in colder weather. So they're going to start foraging when the sun comes up, and when it's warm. So, and then they're not going to be when the sun goes down. So the applications to a flowering crop during this time would be, you're going to be killing bees. So right after dark is going to be the best, and then early in the morning will work before sunup if it has little residue. All right, so when crops or ground cover are in bloom, consider using pesticides that have a short activity and apply those between late evening and early morning. So the bottom line, do not apply pesticides that have an ERT during bloom. And one thing I know with what they do with a lot of the melon crops, cucurbits, a lot of those blooms, they only last one day. And the bees are pretty good about flying into the flower. So, and those flowers close at night, so they can do their applications when those flowers close. And then the next day when the new flower opens, it doesn't have any pesticides in the flower. So then the bees can go in and be safe. So read and understand the label, because you're always supposed to read the label. A lot of them are now having pollinator protection statements on them for these ERT pesticides. And you also want to check the status of the application site. So is the crop in bloom, or check around there and see if we've got some stuff around the edges that is in bloom as well. So eliminate the exposure of these plants. So if you, next to the field, if you have got some blooming in the field edge, some blooming plants, if you can come back and mow it before you spray, so that the bees won't be there because you mowed down the flowers. And you want to do this before you schedule application. So here's if you've seen these on some of these, they're putting these bee advisory box on there in the environmental hazard section of the label. On these pesticides determined to be highly toxic to bees, but it might not have protection statements on them for these ERT pesticides. And you also want to check the status of the application site. So is the crop in bloom, or check around there and see if we've got some stuff around the edges that is in bloom as well. So eliminate the exposure of these plants. So if you, next to the field, if you have got some blooming in the field edge, some blooming plants, if you can come back and mow it before you spray, so that the bees won't be there because you mowed down the flowers. And you want to do this before you schedule application. So here's if you've seen these on some of these, they're putting these bee advisory box on there in the environmental hazard section of the label. On these pesticides determined to be highly toxic to bees, but it might not be exactly like this, but it's going to be something similar. So remember, as we always say, read the labels. Take some time to read and understand the label. And your actions must protect bees during your application and afterwards. So, as growers and applicators, you should know if there's pollinators near a pesticide application site, and they should be able to identify and contact nearby beekeepers prior to application. So we have a different thing about Drift Watch. So that's a different program. I could talk another while about that one, but that's a specialty crop registry site to, increase conversations and communication between applicators and specialty crop growers so we don't have drift. But also there's bees are on that site as well. So if you check that out, people can put their beehives on there in the locations, and you can go on the website and click on those, and they've got the contact information. So if you're going to be doing an application, you check that. We've got some beehives here. You can call up the neighbor and tell them, and they sometimes can be able to shut up that beehive so they won't be active there. Growers and applicators should follow the best management practices to promote pollinator protection and health. All right, so some things to think about. This is going to be long term. What is the growth cycle of the crop? So this is going to be include, when is this crop going to be in bloom? So what time period are we expecting to bloom? And when is the timing going to be where we're expecting pests? So if those two line up, we're going to have to be careful with our pesticide choices. Where else is blooming near the field? Is there wildflowers or something right next to it? Cover crops is another thing you have to be careful with. Weeds as well, and stuff in the fence row, and also adjacent crops and orchards. So being aware of what your neighbor's growing as well. And what pollinator activity is nearby. And like I said earlier, can you go ahead and mow something and remove those blooms before your application to reduce that risk? So knowing your landscape, knowing what your neighbors have. So observe the surroundings, know what's in the adjacent field. So here we see, and here we've got in the next to the soybeans field, we have apples and blueberries and some strawberries here. So these are going to be blooming at different periods. And so being aware of what the neighbors have growing and just being a good neighbor will be helpful for everyone. Because if you kill the bees, then they're going to have a poor crop of their fruit too. So this is just a good thing to have, an IPM plan, integrated pest management. So sometimes you can use non-chemical means, cultural controls, to control these insect pests. So if there's a variety that has more resistance to an insect, then you won't need to apply an insecticide. That might be a choice you can make. And using the pesticides only when needed. So it's not it's the middle of July, we got to do an insecticide treatment. We go out and scout and make sure we have the pests present that we need to make those applications. And when doing your application, as always, you want to prevent drift. And I mentioned before, communication with beekeepers. So locate those beekeepers and have open communication with them about applications. Beekeepers, like I mentioned, the Drift Watch or Bee Check is their system. They can be on there, and it's a really nice system to go quickly check, find those contact info, and have that communication, because they can close up. I think it was in northern Indiana this year and last year with what was that equine encephalitis, that disease. The state made some aerial applications, and some beekeepers were able, well, I heard a story where one closed up some of their hives and some they didn't, and the ones they didn't, those hives got killed. So there's those things that they can take, actions they can take to mitigate their risk as well. All right. So what does the EPA change with the pesticide labels to help protect pollinators? They added the pollinator protection language and added a bee hazard icon. What does it mean to have foraging bees on the intended application site? You can apply the non-ERT pesticides from dusk until dawn. When are pollinator poisonings most likely to occur? When pesticides are applied to crops during the bloom period. What additional information might be useful to you when deciding what, where, and when to spray? So a lot of this stuff. So not in what was in the field last year, the location of your field, what's flowering in and around the field, and are there any sensitive areas that pollinators might be present. So if we've got neighboring crops that require pollination or natural areas, those are some things to consider. All right, so any questions on this or anything else?